Hello, everybody. We're just about set to start. This is Brandon Vance speaking here. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us already for this webinar. We had a great showing of registrants. Nearly 100 people are registered. Assuming those that haven't joined yet will be joining us soon, or can always watch it on our recordings, which are posted on our website. So today we have Dr. Susanna Karakesh presenting on this pandemic and its effects on stress related to PTSD. Susanna is a postdoctoral fellow working for CROSS. She brings tremendous amount of experience in clinical psychology and occupational health psychology. So we're excited and privileged to have her speak with us and prepare this presentation for us today. Her presentation will be roughly 40 minutes long. And at that point, we'll have a question period. So I will ask for those to save your questions to the end, because for this particular webinar, it's going to be a little bit more interactive than usual. There are going to be certain points where Susanna is going to be asking for some input or first answer a couple questions to direct her presentation. So when she gives us those prompts, I want you to click down at the chat box and either send your feedback or your answer directly to Susanna or to all the panelists. That way she can kind of see what you're saying and then direct her presentation from there. So that'll happen a couple times throughout the presentation, so be aware of that. And then when we get to the end, I'll get you to get back into that chat box and post your questions there. So with that, I will let Susanna begin whenever she's ready. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. So welcome everyone to today's webinar, which is supposed to be about stress experience, especially during pandemic. And when you kind of like read the little intro, you could say that I tried to answer a lot of questions. I can't guarantee that I will answer all the questions, but we try definitely. And I'm pretty sure that you also kind of like have a lot of external resources that are addressing the experience of stress during pandemic in general. And like, I don't know about you, but I'm receiving probably like 10 emails per day from like different organizations, including the organization where I work, that kind of like tells me like, here is the help and how this is how you could kind of like cope with stress during COVID. So I don't want to kind of like add an extra layer of those resources because they are out there. And there is a lot of people working on putting together, the best strategies for that. I would like to actually take a step back and have just a better understanding on stress. And I'm really going back to basics for that specific reasons. Because if we have a good understanding of like what stress experience means to us, I definitely think that we would have just a different perspective of how we are even using or assessing those resources that are out there for us. Brandon was not telling you in the introduction, but I am not from Canada originally. So if there is something that you did not understand, definitely kind of like just let me know when we have the chance to answer questions and I try to clarify your points. Brandon also told you that I will actually prompt you and I will hopefully receive answers to my questions. However, I'm asking you try to send everything either directly to me or to the panelists, because in this way, not everyone sees your answer, so you can keep your personal opinion private, but it definitely would help the flow of the presentation. So let's start, especially when my computer also like cooperates. So let's start with a little checking in. And here's my first question actually. So how are you feeling right now? If you can just privately share with me how are you feeling right now, that would be like fantastic. And I have other questions like, do you know how were you feeling an hour ago? Do you remember? And did you kind of like note how you were feeling when you woke up this morning? Also, when you think about like, yeah, how was your day yesterday? And my question is definitely like, are you usually aware of your feelings? I started to receive your answers. Thank you so much. So there are some people who report being overwhelmed. Some people feel good. Other people feel like demotivated or procrastinating. Some people are energized, stretched. So definitely, kind of like there's a lot of emotions, and I am very happy that you are reporting those things. Just even if you're not sending it to me, just make a note for yourself, please, because we would like to use those pieces of information when you are reporting, like how are you feeling right now. Okay, so here is I think an interesting fact. We have about 459 emotional experiences each day. Did you know that? It's a lot, right? So different studies are telling us that an average person usually kind of like goes through like 27 emotions in an hour. Are we really aware of that? Again, generally speaking, I don't think so. Um, why is that important for us? And I'm going back to awareness. So when you think about it, and if I'm telling you like, okay, 27 different emotional experiences in an hour, it sounds overwhelming, or at least it sounds overwhelming for me. But what actually is emotion? Like, can you help me to define what emotions could be? When you think of emotions, what is really an emotion? Any type of definition, I would be happy to see. Okay, so some of you started just to kind of like still report certain specific emotions. Some people is telling me that, yeah, emotions are and feelings are kind of like interchangeable terms, which is also good. Actually, a couple of people told me that it's a reaction to a situation. We are also going about like how consciously we are perceiving things, and that relates to emotions as well. Okay, I have a more scientific approach here. Someone is telling me that emotion is a neurological response to an external stimuli. Okay, so let's see what I do have here. Emotions are result from complex interactions of biological, cognitive, behavioral, and social cultural processes. I think it's kind of like a great definition. Probably you can also tell me like, okay, it doesn't really like catches what we are talking here about. On the other hand, I think actually it does, because obviously like we are experiencing certain things, but again, like awareness is definitely kind of like different on different levels. So we don't necessarily like are aware of like the biological and the chemical responses that our body and brain actually does when we go through a certain emotion. The cognitive part would be like very, very important for the today's presentation, meaning actually like how we think, it definitely does influences how we feel. And this is a huge asset to know, because if we are aware of like how we think, we can have a better control over like how we are reacting to the emotions that we are feeling. Behavioral part, again, we might not realize, but how we behave is actually like also interacts with our emotions. And again, it influences the outcome. So when I asked you to report like how do you feel, um, it's kind of like important to realize sometimes, and important to check in within ourselves, because we might not realize like how we are making like, you know, a certain choice, like eating food, or doing or not doing exercise, or doing or not doing our work. It could actually be influenced by our emotions, but until we have this reflection, we might actually not be able to deal with the consequences of those emotions. There are other characteristics of emotions that I'm not necessarily want to go into more details, just kind of like giving you information when you would like to kind of like do your research on it in the future. But I really like this picture here. You know, many times when we try to figure out like how people generally speaking kind of like manage their emotions, we have this test like, okay, like what's going to happen with this glass? Like, is it empty? Is it full? Is it half full, half empty? Like, what is the perspective? However, being realistic about the situation and assessing the situation properly, we would know that actually the glass is completely full. That's a different story, that we might not actually be aware of the presence of the air, but it's still there, right? So that's kind of like somewhat how we approach emotions as well. If we are more aware of like what is realistic in that situation, we might have a different way of thinking that could reflect back on our emotions. Again, generally speaking, when we talk about like positive and negative emotions, uh, there are a couple of kind of like beliefs that I would like to clarify. So positive and negative emotions are relatively independent. So how often feel like positive emotions or negative emotions, they are not really connected. They are independent emotions. Um, and when we have more positive emotions, again, it won't create fewer negatives. However, if we kind of like try to look into like how generally speaking people report emotions when they are actually asked to create like a conscious awareness about that, then generally speaking, like an average person would report like 2.5 positive feelings uh, and one negative feelings in a certain given time. So that is the ratio, like how most people would actually like go through their days. Why is that important? Um, I don't know how often do you hear um, those pieces of advice like, yeah, be positive, think positive, and problems will be solved. No. Thinking positive is very, very important. And we actually like aim for a minimum ratio of like 3 positive emotions to 1 negative emotion. But being unrealistically positive creates actually like more problems than good. And that's where, again, like the picture with the glass, which is actually technically completely full, has a good message for us, because it's important to be realistic about like what is really happening, instead of like going either into the negative direction unreasonably or being just overwhelmingly positive, and that could lead to disappointment, um, feelings that are actually like not helping us, because they are not based on evidence and they are not based on like realistic expectations. So I would definitely use that information later throughout the presentation. But now I'm going back to the original question. So do you remember how you felt at the beginning of the presentation? Did you write down like how you felt? I just would like you to kind of like stop there and remember. I remember how I felt when I started the presentation. Now I will say some words: pandemic, COVID-19, restrictions, social isolation, 6 feet apart. So I just started to tell you those words. How do you feel now? Okay, I started to get your response. Those words cause immense anxiety, very concerned. Some people actually still feel the same. However, I cannot backtrack why I'm talking to you. Like, what was your original emotion that you reported to me? Okay, like most of the answers are actually around anxiety. I had some answers from you like that were around anxiety, but you had also like a lot of positive feelings. Again, what has just happened here? Our emotions have changed based on mostly our experiences and our previous knowledge that was related to those words. So I just wanted to show you that your thinking, what you knew before, so all the cognitive pieces had a tremendous influence how you felt. And that's my point. Because that also gives us a chance to kind of like go back to the root of the problem and address it from the beginning. So let's work with the stress, because time is actually like goes by faster than I expected. So when I kind of like start to talk about stress, I think this kind of like picture sums it up very well. I'm so stressed about being stressed out that I can't even remember why I'm stressed out, and it's stressing me out. Many times I hear something like that. So again, a question: what does stress mean to you? And my other question is, how are stress and health related to each other? And I'm just curious about your perspective here. You don't need to come up with like any type of scientific explanation. What does stress mean to you? I'm just kind of like waiting for answers to come in. So some people is telling me loss of control, being overwhelmed, hard to sleep. Some people are telling me actually stress is motivating. Good. Um, some people is telling me that we need stress, but it's also like definitely like a negative experience. Okay. And someone told me that we have actually like adverse effect on health, which is like very true. Okay, so let's go to like official definitions. Okay, um, when we go there, actually like, and I would like you to realize, stress is a normal evolutionary response to any potential harm-causing factor, and it's a non-specific response. Both things are actually very, very important. Okay, because most of the time what we think about stress is that like, oh my goodness, like that's harm causing, like we would like to avoid it, it's not good, it's not okay. But in reality, it's a normal evolutionary response, and it's the response on its own is not specific. Okay, I will let you know what does that mean, but just please remember the definition and keep in mind what we are talking about here. Excuse me. So there is another definition that I would like to go to into details. So stress is also defined as the circumstances in which a person, environment, transaction lead a person to perceive a discrepancy between the demands of the situation and the resources that the person has. Okay, I really like this definition, and probably you can already see I like definitions in general, because again, a good definition kind of like guides us through the whole concept, what we need to deal with. So again, if you see that, hey, if I'm stressed, I need to kind of like check my resources. I need to also check what is the demand of the situation, how those things are matching, and how I can actually like, create like a transaction with my environment to kind of like measure those things. Then you have actually a pretty good plan to fix it, whatever the cause was, right? And if you realize like, yeah, I don't have enough resources, again, like where to look for solutions. If you see like, okay, like the demands of the situations are actually like not as high as I thought, again, you could have a good plan. So the reason why I like actually this definition of stress, because it kind of like helps us to create a good action plan to manage stress better. Okay, let's move forward. And I'm going back actually to the first true definition, which was um, done by a guy called Hans Scheie. Sorry that I'm not able to pronounce it in the Canadian way, but he was a Hungarian guy like me, and he came to Canada and he worked in Montreal, and that's where he came up with all these kind of like fantastic explanation of stress. So he kind of like, I'm kind of following his pathway, like being born in Hungary and coming to Canada. And now I'm talking to you about stress that he actually like made his research on. So again, normal and non-specific response. Why are those words are so important that I'm telling you for the third time? Because when we have so many unknown factors, it's so normal that we are reacting with a stress response, which has a specific purpose in our lives and in our body. So hopefully you are kind of like not shocked by the fact that I'm telling you that being stressed is normal. But that's what I'm telling you. That being stressed under specific circumstances is not just pretty normal, but it's very, very helpful. So hopefully that information is not too shocking, but I just wanted to give you an example. On the picture, you can see me. This is one of my happy moments, which is actually one of the nightmares of my mom. And probably you can see that again, like the same situation could be just viewed completely differently based on like how we think about it and where we put the emphasis on. Okay. If I try to explain a concept, I always find that it's useful to understand like what it refers to. So actually, stress as a word comes from the Latin strictus, and it means like narrow, drawn tie. So it's kind of like goes into that direction. But we have two types of stress: eustress and distress. However, in our everyday life, we are kind of like overusing the word stress, and most of the time we just refer to the part which is actually distress. But there is something that we completely ignore, or we tend to completely ignore, and that's eustress. So again, an example. Eustress for me, like this kind of like hiking trip. The picture was taken like kind of like pretty high after a long day hike. And probably you can also see that the gravel was a little bit tricky to manage. But that was like an amazing experience. And I felt like challenged, energized. That was a positive stress to me. And actually, like it made me just kind of like feel excited, happy, and all those positive feelings. So that's why it is so important to realize that actually stress is really good for us. However, and I stay with the same experience and with the same picture, when I'm talking about de-stress, that's the negative stress, the demanding one, the overwhelming one, the harmful one. And 10 minutes after taking this picture, I dislocated my knee on the third day of a 14-day hiking trip. And there was like 250-kilometer distance still ahead. Well, I can tell you that I definitely managed it with the dislocated knee. The physiological stress reaction definitely helped me to survive, and also with the pain management, at least for a couple of hours. But the fact that I dislocated my knee, it definitely caused demands where I felt overwhelmed, and it was not really healthy. However, if I think back to the whole trip, it was a fantastic trip. I managed it, and I spent like a couple of months to heal after. But this is the point again, like the same situation could be viewed from different perspective. And I would like you to realize that actually the original non-specific like stress response is originally intends to help us to deal with the situation. So even what we are experiencing right now in the pandemic, it intends to help us. That's the point. Okay. And if we don't have enough stress, then we are inactive, not motivated, we are bored, we cannot really perform. So it's really, really important. If you look back actually, or you look at the picture, like you can see the peak performance is actually happens under an optimal level of stress experience that helps us to keep focus. It helps us to like be motivated. However, if we kind of like go over of the top, then we start to feel fatigued, exhausted, and the stress overload starts. There are a couple of things that could contribute to that. For example, again, like we talked about the demands, the discrepancy between like our resources and the demands, or even just the duration of the stress situation. But again, the point is like we might have certain tools that could help us to keep on the eustress side as long as possible. And that would be like our goal or our purpose. So we are going back to the same definition again. How is it possible to keep us on the positive side of the stress experience? And again, the words are really important here. because there is a difference between stress response and stress reaction. The stress response that we are experiencing, it's an automatic thing. So what happens in us physiologically, it's automatic. However, how we react to that experience, that requires some reflection. And again, this is where the cognitive part comes into the game. Because if you reflect on the stress, we can actually control so much more. So what do we mean here? I just tried to kind of like create like a slide with the physiological response and the psychological response. I think when we talk about the physiological response, we can just kind of like think about it like very easily and come up with the physiological symptoms of being stressed. However, how we kind of like interpret those responses would help us to kind of like create a different outcome on the psychological side. Here you can see the behavioral, cognitive, and emotional levels of those responses. So what belongs to the behavioral part? Health habits like sleep, eating, and you already mentioned sleep. You already mentioned like nutrition when you answered. The cognitive part, like how focused we are, or how can we concentrate, or like how our memory works. I think you also kind of like have a lot of experience when we are in the negative part of the stress, like how it affects our functioning in that way. And on the emotional part, we can feel excitement, nervousness, energy, worry. There's a lot of emotions that we can feel as a result of stress. And again, it matters if we are talking about de-stress or eustress. Let's try to give you another example. Stress response in case of going on a date. Just give me some ideas, like how do you imagine a stress response in case of going on a date? I'm helping you with the physiological kind of like response picture. Okay, anxious, sweating, nervousness. Okay, so increased heart rate. If we are experiencing all those things, nervousness, sweating, anxiety, why are we going on a date? I thought like going on a date is kind of like something fun, hopefully. So again, what's happening here? Oh, we talk about excitement here. But the tricky part is like excitement could have the same physiological reactions, right? If I'm excited, my heart rate kind of like still goes up higher. If I'm nervous, still the same. So how do I know if it's an excitement or is it like nervousness? And hopefully you start to get it. It actually like it's up to like my cognitive interpretation of those physiological symptoms that are part of the stress response. Okay, my next question. Is there any difference depending on whether the date went well or it was a disaster? No answer yet. I can tell you yes. Because this is what it actually like makes the difference. How I think about and how I evaluate the situation would actually kind of like help me to come up with a good explanation and evaluation of my stress experience. So the reason why I choose this example, because I wanted to show you that we are all experiencing situations where we can easily see the same thing from the perspective of eustress, which is positive, and from the perspective of distress, which is negative. I hope not all of you had like disasters like experience like going out on a date, but it could happen. And then, we kind of like just figure out like we are not going to another one, or this is not my partner, which is okay. But again, the psychological response was actually influenced by my reaction cognitively and it was influenced by my emotions, and it changes my behavior, right? So if you are telling me that, like, hey, I can do that, I can't kind of like, use my thinking to change my stress experience, I would say, like, probably that's not true. What I'm saying is probably you are not aware of the fact that you can do this and you are actually practicing this. I just would like you to have like more awareness when you are doing it. So next question, stress response in case of the pandemic. How is that different from going on a date? Here is the funny thing. The physiological response is not different. Funny, but it's not. It's the same as you were going on a date. But what is different? The cognitive and emotional and behavioral reaction to it. So I have this answer that potential for life changing if virus is contacted. So here's the thing. There is also a potential that on a date you will find the love of your life, and that's going to change your life. I know. I don't want to say that it's the same, but what I'm going to say is if we are actually like experiencing like something stressful, it causes stress because it's important. That's what the physiological response tells you. Whatever that situation is, it's freaking important to prepare for it. And all the physiological response is helping you to prepare for it. And that could be fight or flight. That could be like so many things. But again, the stress originally helps you to prepare because there is something important happening here. Something important change is about to happen. So we need to prepare for it. And again, my cognitive evaluation is really, really important. And where I put the emphasis, it could help me to create like some control here. Okay, so for example, the cognitive piece in case of pandemic, what can you concentrate on? Are you focusing on like listening to the news like 5 hours a day or 10 minutes a day and you are done and then you focus on something else? Again, behavioral decisions. I was not going into so many details because I can actually just talk to you on stress for like a whole semester and I won't be still finished. So there are just so many things to share. I try to like simplify things. That's true because we have just certain amount of time and we are even running out of that. But here's the thing, like it could happen that you can sleep properly before going out with someone because you are so excited or because like you are just so like eager to see that person again. Again, we are talking about the same physiological reaction. Or eating. Some people can't eat before going out on a date because it's just so important and so exciting and they feel this butterfly in the stomach. But that's also like a symptom of anxiety too when we are stressed out. But how we interpret the same feeling in our stomach, it depends on our perspective. Don't misunderstand me. It's a basic rule. We never ever want to change emotions. We are accepting emotions how they are. However, the reaction to the emotion, that could be changed. And that's our key to feel different in a situation. Okay. So just giving you one example, the things that you are focusing on cognitively and how you are managing your behavior in case of like a very de-stressing experience could actually influence like how you conclude about that situation specifically with your emotional reaction. But most of the time we are not aware of them. Again, that's why I try to give you this example with going on a date, because you can do actually like both sides of the story in a situation where you don't see the demands like just potentially too high. And that's my point. You can do it. The rest is up to practicing it. So again, I'm going back to the response reaction difference. There is a physiological response, which is exactly the same in case of the positive and in case of the negative stress. But when we talk about like the psychological reaction, then we actually have this perspective on the whole situation where we are more in charge of our reaction. So my message here is take control of the reaction part, evaluate the situation properly, then you might have a better chance to actually turn situations more realistic than just focusing on the negative. And if you're going into the more realistic direction, then we are actually like going more realistically toward the solution. And again, if you remember the definition of stress when we talked about resources, demands, the discrepancy, and how we can kind of like try to figure out interaction with our environment to solve it, it could open up just like different pathways to approach the situation and have different questions that are very much more useful to address the situation than just kind of like repeat the same cycle over and over again. So again, the message here, our perception of stress does matter a lot. Going back to the situation, what I try to kind of like emphasize here is the perception that we have on the situation. And our perception could be kind of like trained to be different and not just kind of like, stop evaluating the situation at the stressor and kind of like being stuck with the physiological stress response. Because if we are stuck with the physiological stress response, we miss out on this whole thing that I just told you about. We miss on that thing like how our personal appraisal, our perception could be useful to have actually a good reaction to that situation. Again, under the circumstances. The role of appraisal. Again, I'm trying to kind of like simplify things here. We need to kind of like focus on like how we are approaching that situation. And are we seeing it as a threat or a challenge? And you might tell me like, yeah, it's kind of like pretty limited what we can see like as a challenge here in the current situation. And I would say like, probably it's very, very unique and different for each individual. But there is still a potential to find daily challenges that we can resolve in order to maintain a better balance. When we do like another kind of like appraisal about the situation, the major questions are, can I cope with it? And what are my available resources? And I try to give you like a totally different example, which is very different from the pandemic, but hopefully still kind of like shows you how the difference could create a completely different outcome. What is also kind of like tricky in this pandemic situation, that we actually have like 3 groups of major stressors. We call them like catastrophe, significant life changes, and daily hassles. I just kind of like gave you like a short definition of catastrophes in this context. But these are the major kind of like groups of stressors that we do experience. So if you think about what we talked about stress so far, you probably would easily see that stressors during the pandemic could fall in all of those categories. But again, let's just kind of like step back a little bit here and see like what's going on when we look at the definition. So do we have a pre-existing coping toolkit for the pandemic? No. And that's why it's kind of like pretty stressful. But we are in the process of figuring it out. And every single day we are a step ahead. What are the demands of the situation? Do we know? No. We are in the process of figuring it out, and every single day we learn a little bit more about that too. Um, Discrepancy. Again, because we don't know the resources, we don't know the demands of the situations 100%ly. We can't really kind of like be good at estimating the discrepancy, but we are in the process of figuring this out. And again, our assessment of the pandemic caused situations probably changes every single day, how we are learning more and more information about it. And again, it goes back to the same point. Just because we don't know it, it doesn't mean that we won't know it, or it doesn't disqualify the fact that we are in the process of figuring it out. And a lot of people are professionally working on giving us like professional answers. And I think that's also kind of like important. When we try to come up with the appraisal part of the situation, um, there are like four different groups that are kind of like significant when we appraise an event stressful. So you can see it here: salient events, overload, ambiguous event, and uncontrollable events. Here is the reality. The pandemic created a situation that falls into each of those categories, right? I just kind of like wrote down examples, and we know it. We don't need to argue on that. Like, it's an ambiguous event, and it's kind of like an event that has a lot of uncontrollable factors. So again, the reasons are very, how can I say, supported why we do feel stressed in this situation. But again, if I am looking into those specific categories, I might be able to come up with a better plan for myself, or where I would like to put the focus on. And the power of yet is very significant, because at the end of the day, it's okay not to have answers immediately, because we are getting there every single day. And it's also okay if we cannot solve all the problems all at once, what the pandemic created for us, but we are working on it. And we also need to realize that the effort is important, and we are doing better and better every day, even creating new routines, or figuring out how to adjust to the changes, or how does it feel to go to the grocery store, covering our face. Or we are experiencing every single day something that we haven't had before, but we also slowly but surely could figure it out, that yeah, it works. Yep, we can manage that. Yep, it's not necessarily as bad as I imagined. And that's also a very important thing that it's important to acknowledge. Again, and here we are with the visual kind of explanation of what I already told you, that actually pandemic covers all the major sources of stressors. And for each one of us, it covers it in a very unique way. Some people lost the job, some people couldn't finish the courses at the university as they wanted, some people were in the process of getting divorced and they are stuck. Our daily routine has changed, so there are so many changes in all those areas that are definitely creating challenges all at once. And that's why it might be important for us actually to evaluate what those challenges are, creating a priority solution strategy. And here is the thing: it could happen that it's not going to work for the first try, but that's okay, because you still can learn a lot from those experiences and trials. I put here this picture about crisis and opportunity. You probably already know I really kind of figuring out what the word means. So crisis originally means decision or turning point. And I like it so much better than the word crisis, because we overused it a lot. If you can see those moments as turning points where we need to make decisions, again, you might be able to have just a way much better action plans. related to the specific problems. Again, just on crisis, I could talk to you probably like for 2 weeks. So I'm not going there. Again, I understand that I simplify things a little bit here, but there is a good reason for that, because I just would like to show you like a different way of thinking in general. Adjusting to stressful events. We might not realize, but dealing with problems is part of normal life. However, our perspective could be like just very different. Think about it, like when you are moving, away from your parents, going to school, it's exciting, it's challenging. Yeah, there is a little bit of like scariness, but we are full of hopes and full of like, good plans. But if you think about it, it's a major life change with a lot of problems that we need to solve. Still, having that kind of like picture in front of us that it's going to be all right, it helps us to push it through. Many times we kind of like don't realize how important it is to understand that dealing with problems, that's what we do every day. And if we solve a problem, it will create another problem, and we will solve that too. If we experience like significant problems, setbacks, huge decisions that are alter our life, again, most of the time we recover from those things like very fast. Because we have this thing that is called adaptation, and that's what stress response prepares us for. And again, stress response as a non-specific kind of like thing is just helping us to understand that this is important, so we need to focus on how we are dealing with it. We talked about emotions at the beginning. Emotions are tremendously important when it's about like expressing or evaluating stress, and we can use that as part of our strategy. However, one thing about stress is not the same. It's not expressing emotions related to stress. It's about repeating something without like finding solutions. So please don't kind of like mismatch the two. Sense of personal control. And that's my point with this whole presentation, to give you a sense of personal control over your stress reaction. Because all the stress management tools out there that are referring to COVID-19 or any other problems in life, they are actually like helping you to get this sense of personal control. But if you don't understand that how stress works, you might actually miss the point, and then you are just kind of like doing an exercise without making any sense for you, and you might not get the desired result. So the sense of personal control is definitely kind of like something that helps us to put the emphasis where we have the chance to change something. Okay. Here's another term: stress resistance. We are very different in that sense. So like how resistant we are to stress, but it's also like something that we can change, and there is a lot to learn about. And when we are talking about stress resistance, the appraisal process we talked about is amazingly important. That also leads to like choosing better coping skills. I'm not talking here about like the personality traits or spirituality, but they are part of it. I just wanted to kind of like put it there. And the quality of social support, which I would like to talk to you about a little bit. So social support is actually like one of the major things that helps us not to get sick, whatever it means. Okay, physically, mentally, social support is a huge buffer. It's a huge help. So it has like a lot of benefits. And there is like something that I would like to emphasize here. It's a specific hormone. It's kind of like usually known as a cuddle hormone, the oxytocin. The reason why I wanted to talk to you about it, because most of the time when we talk about stress, we just talk about cortisol and how cortisol is bad for us. However, that's not true. Cortisol is actually like helps us to focus and prepare our body to deal with the stressor. If we have too much cortisol, then when problems start. But here is this oxytocin. Sorry, my computer kicked me out. So here is this oxytocin that usually happens to be produced when we have experienced social support. And it could mean like literally being like physically hugged, but not necessarily. And that's part of the normal stress response. The reason why it is so important, because in our normal stress response, we have built-in mechanism that actually immediately protects us from the negative effects of stress. And oxytocin is actually like something that protects our heart, our cardiovascular system. It has like anti-inflammatory effect on us, and that's part of our normal stress reaction. And we can boost it up, we can enhance it if we are engaging in social support more consciously. The role of social support during the pandemic. Tricky question here, because we all know that social distancing is not helping us, right? But again, knowing about like how important social support is in stress reaction and stress response could help us to understand why it is so important keeping in touch, even volunteering, even if it happens online, because there are so many alternative ways keeping in touch with each other and offering and seeking support throughout this period of time. It saves us and it makes us like more resistant toward like the negative effects of stress. Okay. Do you remember that I asked you at the beginning what you think of the relationship and stress and health? And like some people already told me like it has an adverse effect, which is very correct. But we usually focus on the negative, and we have all that news like how stress is bad for us. And I would like to kind of like emphasize that no, stress actually could be good for us and could be bad for us. And it depends on like how we are dealing with it, how we perceive it, because that's what it changes how we behave, how we react, and what is the result of our stress experience. So by way of summary here, changing and improve our perspective on stress is very important, because eustress, the positive stress, is real. And the stress response originally is a very helpful thing that we can use in order to have better strategies to stay healthy, to be prepared to deal with the problems, what we are challenged by. And actually, we have some psychosocial modifiers of our immune system reactivity that could help us to stay longer on the healthy side, which is social support, expressing feelings, and being optimistic in a realistic way. Again, I could talk to you about like optimism for like, again, a long time. Hold on, almost done. I'm aware of the fact that like you might not be able to stay with me, because sorry for that. It just takes longer than I thought. What is normal during the pandemic? If somebody tells you that, you know, like they are not affected by the stress of the pandemic, that's not true. It can't be true. We are all affected by it. And as I showed you, like we don't have like a specific toolkit that is like, hey, this is what you do during pandemic. Next time we would have something, but hopefully there is not going to be a next time, but who knows, right? Anyway, we are working on it, and it's still important. But the stress response tells us that we are in the process of dealing with it. And I hope that I could give you an insight like how it is important to change our perspective on stress. I also promised you that I will talk a little bit about mental health issues during pandemic, and that would be like way much shorter. So those who have already been diagnosed with mental health issues are at greater risk, no question. We can see like how certain symptomatology just kind of like went up like high very fast, like anxiety, depression, OCD related symptoms like substance use, addictions, just name a few. I would say like probably health anxiety rates one of the biggest problems at this point that we need to deal with. Um, and definitely like a lot of people out there try to address those things. Um, when we talk about like specific occupations, um, I would say like it's really tricky to kind of like come up with risk factors specifically, because there is like a lot out there, but there are also like a lot of protective factors. Um, but one major issue is like still stigma, especially toward those people who might work in close contact with those who actually got sick from the virus, and how they are viewed by others, even sometimes by their friends and family members. And because of that, they actually have even bigger gap to receive social support. And the other risk factor that could happen, that like some people are more visible being on frontline, but some occupations are less visible, but they are still there. Just think about lab technicians who are kind of like analyzing all those blood test results, right? um, but I don't want to go into details, because I don't want to create like a like a situation where like, okay, I didn't mention that occupation or another occupation, because it's still important. Like a lot of people out there deals with actually a lot of new and extra stressors related to everyday work, because of the changes that pandemic caused. I also wanted to just do a quick overview of the trauma and stress related disorders, because a lot of people are asking questions like how like the PTSD rate would be affected, or like what is really happening in that sense. So I would say adjustment disorders are probably the most common things that we do see. But actually, like that's the most common stress related disorder regardless that we do see. And even though it creates like marked distress, it usually kind of like goes away with or without help in about like a half a year period of time. When we talk about like acute stress disorder and PTSD, there are very important criteria, and one of those criteria are like the exposure to traumatic events, which might be true for very few, thankfully, especially here in Canada. Um, and you can also see like acute stress disorder and even adjustment disorder could be understood better if you realize that the physiological stress response happens to us, but it doesn't necessarily causes in the long-term mental health problems or mental health issues. PTSD is even more tricky, because we kind of like say like it could be only diagnosed at least a month after the trauma occurs. So we don't have like data on PTSD at this point. But I would like you to know that 50 to 80% of the general population goes through some type of traumatic event in their lifetime. It's not unusual, unfortunately. And most of the people would not develop PTSD. So for Canada, for example, 9.2% of the population has a lifetime prevalence rate for post-traumatic stress disorder. And again, 80% of the population has some type of a traumatic event in their life. So if you put those two together, you can see that like, yes, there are people who might be affected, but not going through a traumatic experience doesn't equal PTSD. And when we talk about traumatic experience, here you can also see like how we define it. So it's experiencing or witnessing death, threatened death, serious injury, violence, natural disasters. So we have actually like very specific criteria. Most of the time, in general, again, trauma experience does not indicate the development of PTSD. It's more about the pre, peri, and post-traumatic risk factors. And if you look into like the occupational risk and protective factors, they are actually balancing it out like very well. When we look into first responders, Generally speaking, um, kind of like the prevalence rate varies somewhere between like 8% to like 27, 35% max. And it depends on so many factors. Um, and again, like mostly those other risk factors are creating the vulnerability, not necessarily the traumatic experiences. You might think, okay, like did I answer your question? Probably I don't have like the right answer here yet. When you look into the studies after like SARS, you would also see that the majority of people experienced actually the normal adjustment disorder related symptoms that are consequences of the heightened stress response. Acute stress disorder seem not to be kind of like coming up, and mostly like those people experienced symptoms for a period of time who actually reported extreme or significant kind of like threat caused by the disease. Here is the problem. Um, the problem is that we can't really compare SARS to COVID-19. And again, certain areas are affected more than others. Certain people are not only kind of like experiencing right now that extreme threat related to their own health issue, but in the hospital environment, they can also like witness other people, like suffering, which is also like very, very difficult. So I would also say, like, generally speaking, when we look into like different disasters and traumatic events, the unexpected death of a loved one seemed to be the most triggering or the most problematic. And that could be actually like definitely like measured once we have the tools to measure those things when the pandemic will be over. Again, like there are specific factors like age, being like, female, prior trauma experiences that could contribute to the development of PTSD related symptoms. They are still not saying that those people who have those risk factors will develop PTSD symptoms. But again, an average person experiences like 2 trauma types and about like almost 5 trauma exposure during their lifetime. So it could also like put things into perspective when you estimate like the consequences here. Again, the WHO estimates about like 30 to 50% of the population will be affected by psychological diseases after COVID-19. However, most of those psychological diseases are related to substance use, anxiety and depression. And again, when we look back, like the different studies that were done after SARS, you will be also able to see that like these were mostly the problems there actually like emerged after SARS was over. There was a study done in Toronto among healthcare workers, and from like 139 healthcare workers who were actively dealing with SARS, only one person had symptoms of PTSD. And it was 5% of the prevalence of those who had new onset of a mental health issue that was not pre-existing before SARS. Again, will COVID-19 be similar? I don't think so. And that's why I wrote, and if yes, how different? Because SARS, even though has like kind of like the same virus family than COVID-19, seems to have just very different effect on human beings. And we need to be careful with any type of predictions I think even though the numbers are kind of like telling us a story about the past, it could be just translated with some cautiousness into like future predictions. And that's what I kind of like could give you like as way of summary about like the current situation. And as a summary, I just would like to go back to uh, the perception of stress experience that hopefully gives you more understanding of how to deal with stress and how to use the resources that are out there to manage stress experience throughout this pandemic. So thank you so much for staying with me. Sorry for being so long with this presentation. If you have any question, I would be happy to answer it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Susie, for the presentation. Thank you for taking the time to prepare that for us and for presenting today. Some people did have to go, so I gave them that option of putting in any questions or still waiting to see if there are any. But if not, we can always get them to email us. And I want to thank everyone for joining today. I want to thank you all for sharing your thoughts and for participating in the chat box. That was really helpful. I'm sure you appreciate that a lot, Susie.
Yeah, definitely.
For people that maybe had to miss some of it, you can always go back on our website. It's going to be posted there under our webinar page. And then we have another one coming in June. So more information will be coming out in the next couple of days on our June webinar. And I'll share that information for registration then. I don't see any questions. So I think we're safe to say goodbye and thank you all again. And thank you, Susie. Have a good day.
You too. Bye-bye.